Okay, hello. Hey, so this is our first thinkative cheeky half. We're just going to have a short little chat here with a couple of friends of mine, an old friend and a new friend. So we have Erik Curiel, who was my classmate at the University of Chicago.
Hello.
And a student of Howard Stein like myself. And we are here, by the way, for a conference about the work of Howard Stein. And Erik is at the Center for Mathematical Philosophy in Munich. And then we have Tom Pashby, who is a philosopher of physics here at the University of Chicago, where Howard worked and continues to live, and where we're having this conference. So, great to have you guys here. Thank you very much for taking a little time out to do this in the middle of this conference.
Certainly.
Cool.
It's fun.
Great. So, we're here. The conference is about Howard Stein, right? Okay. So, either of you, quick version of who is Howard Stein?
Erik?
Well, Howard was, I can give you some biographical information. He did his PhD under Rudolf Carnap. He wrote a string of seminal, very important papers in philosophy of science, history of physics, philosophy of physics. He philosophy of mathematics, general philosophy of science. He was incredibly respected and revered, figure in the field for I think pretty much his entire career, and he was just an extraordinary, wise and deep and wonderful thinker, and a very severe and difficult, but very rewarding teacher, as I think Matt, you can attest to as well.
Yes, very certainly severe and rewarding. Tom, have you had any contact with Howard?
Only by email, actually.
Okay.
Yeah, I was hoping to meet him this weekend, but he wasn't able to make it yesterday.
And did he harsh you by email at all?
No, he was incredibly kind and humble, so I think once he gets to know you, he can really try and...
Then he'll start correcting your
Yeah.
yes.
He is an incredibly kind and humble person.
He is.
But we're not here just to talk about Howard, but his work. So one of the things that, his first major paper, Newtonian Spacetime, right? Very interesting paper. Tom, maybe are you familiar with it enough to just? And remember, this is just for everybody. So what would you tell a non-philosopher about what this paper says? I know it's tough because it's technical stuff.
So it's a way of trying to find a precise way to formulate some of the notions that Newton was using sort of explicitly in the way he defined things in the Principia, and sort of implicitly in the way that his mechanics worked, and how he used it to actually treat phenomena and calculate things.
Right. Okay. So now
Erik would like to say some more.
I'm sure we'll let Erik jump in. I just want to say something a little bit about it, which is that one of the things that people know about Newton is that he had this idea of space and time, where there's this sort of fixed background. You can sort of picture like a fixed grid of space-time behind us, and we move around on it. And it makes sense to ask, how fast are you moving, or how fast is a particular object moving relative to this background of fixed space-time? But we also know that his physics doesn't really require this fixed space-time, because everything is the same if you're on a ship moving at uniform velocity, as Galileo had pointed out. So one of the things that Howard did in this paper, in the very beginning of the paper, was to define mathematically a space-time structure that's pretty much the minimal required for what Newton was doing. Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I want to say that for me, what's one of the many remarkable things about the paper, and in some way I think it was a really revolutionary paper in 20th century philosophy of physics, is the approach Howard took to analyzing the theory. He didn't restrict himself to a very strict and constrained historicity, thinking he could only use stuff and concepts in Newton's own time, and he didn't approach the theory in the way that I think a lot of earlier 20th century philosophers did, which was by trying to take kind of traditional questions in philosophy and imposing them on the theory, and saying, I have this question I need to answer, theory, what do you say, without really stopping to think about whether it was an appropriate question for the theory, Howard rather just took the theory in its own right, and said, theory, what can you tell me about what are the good questions for me to ask you about what you might have to say about how we do understand in the world and how we might understand the world and what's a fruitful way to think about you, theory. And that was just a radical new approach to thinking about, trying to figure out foundational issues about physical theories.
A special kind of blend of a historical sensibility with also a modern theoretical background. Right. Cool. Okay. And what gave you guys the idea to have this conference?
It actually, so one of our other co-organizers, who is not here at the moment, Kareem Tebold, a philosopher of physics at the University of Bristol, he and I were actually having some beers in Munich and talking about one of Howard's papers, Yes But, Some Skeptical Remarks on Realism and Anti-Realism, maybe Howard's most well-known paper in the broader philosophical world. And Kareem and I were talking about how, in fact, even though it is probably Howard's most well-known paper, it's still probably relatively unknown compared to how great we think it is and how well-known it should be and how many people should read it.
It's not famous enough.
That's right. So we said, let's have a one-day workshop on this paper, and just invite a few people and let's hang out and talk about the paper. And then it just somehow grew, and then we figured it'd be a great idea to have it in Chicago because Howard's here, so we asked Pash to help us, and then it just grew and grew and grew into this big 3-day conference.
Yeah, so I got an email from you telling me about your and Kareem's idea for this conference. I thought, what a fantastic idea! I'd love to go to that conference. And then I kept on reading. It's like, you want me to help organise the conference? Yeah, I see. So that's how it began for me.
And and the Yes But paper, right? So skeptical remarks on realism and anti-realism. So just for people who don't know, so there are these questions about how to interpret science, sort of what the goals of science are. Is it supposed to tell us how things are in the real world, or is it just sort of an instrument, a tool for making predictions of our experiences? And what's Howard saying about this in the paper, Tom?
Well, it's a very interesting paper in the context of this debate, because in a way he's not trying to take a particular sort of principled stand and say this is the right way to consider science. He's saying, well, when we look at how scientists have used these ways of regarding physics, thinking of theories very seriously and taking them very realistically, sometimes it's productive, sometimes it's not, and equally when you don't take the theories seriously, when you think of them instrumentally as just sort of tools, well, sometimes that is very useful, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it doesn't lead to new discoveries. So in a way, this paper is trying to sort of distill some lessons for philosophers from the ways that these ideas are used by physicists, by working scientists.
Okay. So, so his view, though, is that there isn't a big important difference between the realism and anti-realist or instrumentalist views?
Yeah, so the famous line is between a sophisticated instrumentalism that takes the content of the theory sufficiently seriously, doesn't treat the entities as somehow imaginary or fictional, and a realism that's been sort of tempered so that these wild claims about what really exists behind the phenomena have been sort of taken away. There's no difference, or at least no difference that makes a difference. That's the line.
Right, okay. And what did you guys think about Kyle Stanford's discussion of this?
Well, I thought it was a very interesting discussion. So Kyle is one of the very few people at the conference who explicitly tried to argue against Howard. We've all been lionizing Howard and saying how great he is and he's right about everything. I thought it was great that that Kyle came in and said, yeah, Howard is totally great. Howard's totally inspired me, but I think he's wrong about this. And I think I think Kyle gave a very interesting argument that in fact there is a difference between realist and instrumentalist that makes a difference, which is that if you're too strongly realist, then you'll end up being too conservative, and you'll end up shutting down progress in science. And so for Kyle, it makes more sense to be really more instrumentalist. And I think he had some really interesting insights and points, but I think in the end that the criticism of Howard didn't actually work. So I think the ideas are very interesting, but I don't think it actually spoke against Howard's own position.
So he failed to do what you've been trying to do for years, which is to
That's right.
prove Howard wrong about
That's
something.
right. I've been trying to prove Howard wrong for 20 years, and
Yeah, and
never have.
I think George said at some point that even Howard has, has said things that he wouldn't say now, and I thought, well, George, if you could think of one of them, I bet you could sell it to Erik Curiel.
Well,
Okay.
I mean, obviously, there are like, sentences here and there where Howard will make some small claim. I disagree with that.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, something big and important that
Yeah,
Howard
yeah.
says that I've never found a serious problem with it. I've only been inspired to try and use it and work with it, and do something good with it.
Good, good. Okay, so now the thing about Kyle is that in his paper he really sort of painted the realist as someone who thinks that that the science we have now, the terms refer, the description is essentially correct, and that's sort of where the conservatism comes from, right? The realists think that science works and and we've got it right, right? But I've never really understood why the realists should believe necessarily that current science is right. It's rather more of a question of like what are the goals of science? That's what where the realist differs from us, from an instrumentalist, right? Would you agree?
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a problem with this characterization of the realist standing there and saying, "Job done, we finished." One of his slides had this notorious picture of George W. Bush with mission accomplished after the initial sort of Iraq War, second Iraq War attack. So yeah, actually, as I said to Carl, I thought he's got the wrong Bush era philosopher. Really, he needs the great Donald Rumsfeld, great epistemology of the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns. And he seems to be suggesting that the realist has to be committed to there only being known unknowns and no unknown unknowns.
Yeah.
So I felt like that was an unfair characterization of what the realist should believe.
Yeah,
well, it certainly stimulated some reactions out of it.
Yeah, I completely agree. I see no reason at all. So Howard talks about the enlightened realist as as the one that there's no difference, that makes a difference with these sophisticated instrumentalists. And like I said, I thought that Kyle was describing a bumpkin realist.
Yeah.
Who just is kind of naive and simple-minded. There's no reason, if you want to be a realist, there's no reason to constrain yourself in that way, to think that we're basically right. Not only think that we're basically right, but we know which parts of it are basically right. There's no reason to constrain yourself like that.
Yeah, that's right. It's basically right, but we don't necessarily know which parts are. It's kind of like the preface paradox, right?
Yeah.
You write down everything you believe, and then in the preface you say, well, something here is probably wrong, but we have to be really careful, though, right? Because we're talking about instrumentalism, we're talking about science doesn't have everything right, and these days, science is heavily under attack from all sides. So when you start talking about instrumentalism, and you start talking about really calling into question the authority of science now, people with very good intentions get very worried, right?
I don't think that being an instrumentalist necessarily calls into question the authority of science at all. I think you can be an instrumentalist and take very, very seriously the idea that science is completely authoritative when it comes to understanding the world and understanding how the world works and how we interact with the world and how we can impose some order and control and structure on the world.
But only at an operational level, right?
Sure.
So only with respect to what we do and what sort of outcomes we observe, not with regard to how things really are at some deeper level.
Sure.
But take, climate science, for example.
Yeah. It
seems like the debate between the realist and the instrumentalist isn't going to touch the issue of whether we should trust climate science or not. For skepticism is, well, are the weather phenomena, is there something lying behind the weather phenomena? That isn't a point that touches on trust, on whether we should trust the results of our science.
I think that's right.
So if the instrumental result of applying climate science is mass disasters and famine, then that's the important thing, right? It doesn't matter if we've got the metaphysics underneath it, correct?
That's right. That's what I would say.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think that's probably all the time that we have. So thank you guys for joining me again, and
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you very much for having us. It's been fun.
Cool. If things go well, then later this evening we'll have another cheeky half with philosopher of biology, among other things, William Winstead.
Oh, you'll love that.
Now I have to stop this. There we go.